Okay, welcome back everyone. We're going to discuss the argument from evil. This is the simplified Modus Tollens version of the argument from evil. If God exists, then there is no evil, but there is evil, so God does not exist. It's valid, as we discussed. It's a Modus Tollens argument, same form as if it's sunny, then it's not raining, but it is raining, so it's not sunny. Some background before we get to the longer version. What is evil? As we discussed in class, we're going to mean evil really broadly. Any kind of pain and suffering experienced by any conscious beings, especially human beings, is going to count. Of course, pain and suffering can have a variety of causes, right? Some causes of pain and suffering are intentional actions, or sometimes, the result of what religious people would consider sins, or what non-religious people might consider morally wrong actions, or vices, right? That's the kind of thing we could mean by moral evil. Murders, theft, all the bad things that people do to one another. Natural evil is the sort of pain and suffering that results just from natural occurrences, earthquakes, famine, plague. Sometimes it's unclear what category a particular kind of evil might fall into. For example, pandemics may have a variety of causes, right? The initial generation of a pandemic might be natural, but the way in which it spreads might also be social. And in that sense, something like a pandemic doesn't quite fit neatly into either category, but it's an evil nevertheless. An interesting question came up in one of the classes about animal pain and suffering. Do we count that as evil? And my short answer is yes. That's not really going to be the focus of much of our discussion, but I think it is important to keep in mind that whatever the theists' answer to the argument from evil is, they had better be able to also accommodate the reality of animal suffering, because their pain is just as real as ours. And the question of why God would allow evil applies to this evil we experience, and it applies to the evil that non-human animals experience as well. 3 attributes of the God of what we call classical theism: omnibenevolence, omnipotence, and omniscience. Really briefly, omnibenevolence is the property of being perfectly morally good, having no moral flaws whatsoever. What does that mean? What does that entail? What actions does a perfectly morally good being do? That in part is going to be the job of the argument from evil, to spell out what a morally good being does. We know at the very least, though, that morally good beings, just from thinking about morally good but imperfect beings that we know in real life, try to eliminate pain and suffering to some extent or another. So that gives you a sense of what omnibenevolence is. It's a sacrifice of one's efforts and time and so on for the sake of preventing or eliminating the pain and suffering of others. Omnipotence is the property of being all-powerful. Any possible action is an action that an omnipotent being can do. Omniscience means being all-knowing. So for every truth about the past, present, or future, if you believe that there are truths about the future, an omniscient being knows those truths. If you believe there are truths about the past, an omniscient being knows those truths as well. So with those definitions in place, we can now lay out the steps of the argument from evil. This is sort of version 1, just to get us a sense of the mechanics of the argument before we tighten it up in response to a counterexample. So here's the first premise of the argument. This is what in class we called B1, or the sort of first bridge principle that Mackey gives us. A perfectly good being eliminates every evil that it can and that it knows about. The idea here is that perfect goodness, whatever else it means, it should at least mean that if you know about some suffering and you also know that you can stop that suffering from happening and you're perfectly good, then your goodness will compel you to prevent it. We're going to just shorten that and make the claim even simpler. A perfectly good being eliminates every evil that it can. I want you to keep in mind that knowledge is also operating in the background here. I'm not going to make omniscience and the knowledge condition an explicit part of our argument, because that would add an additional 3 steps. And the version we have is sort of unwieldy enough already. But just know what omniscience is, and know, if you needed to, what role it would play in this argument. The second claim is a claim that, according to Mackey and defenders of the argument from evil, a theist should accept. It's just a conditional claim that is constitutive of what theism is. If God exists, then God is perfectly good. This is a claim that theists and atheists alike can agree to. The atheist just denies that God does in fact exist. So as we go, I want you to start keeping in mind and being able to see what prior steps in the argument or what justification a given premise relies on. So AE2, for example, if I said, why is the defender of the argument from evil making this claim? Where is this coming from? What justifies it? The answer is it's the definition, part of the definition of classical theism. AE3 follows logically and validly from AE1 and AE2. If a perfectly good being eliminates every evil that it can, and if it's true that God, if God existed, would be perfectly good, then it follows that if God exists, then God eliminates every evil that God can. It's just a specification of here's what a perfectly good being would do if it existed. Hey, by the way, God would be such a being, so God would do that if God existed. Do know that AE3 follows from AE1 and AE2. An omnipotent being can eliminate every evil. That's AE4. It's just a specification of sort of the scope of what an omnipotent being can do with respect to evil. This is Mackey's second bridge principle, and it's a bridge between claims about what God is like on the one hand and claims about evil on the other. So our first bridge principle says, here's what a perfectly good being does to evils that it can eliminate. And the second bridge principle says, here's which evils an omnipotent being can eliminate. AE5 is, again, just a second core constitutive claim of classical theism. If God exists, then God is omnipotent. AE6 follows from 4 and 5. Therefore, if God exists, then God can eliminate every evil. Do know what AE6 follows from. AE7 follows from AE3 and AE6. So once we have at step 3, if God exists, then God eliminates every evil that God can. Well, which evils can God eliminate? AE6 comes in and says all of them. And so AE7, it follows, if God exists, then God does eliminate every evil there is. You need both 3 and 6 to infer that conclusion. Once we have the claim that if God exists, then God eliminates every evil, it follows that if God exists, then there is no evil. And that just follows from AE1. And you'll notice that that is itself the first premise of the simplified argument from evil. So in effect, what we've been doing is, in class I mentioned that the claim that there is evil is uncontroversial, right? And so if the theist is going to push back anywhere against the simplified version, it's going to be against this claim that God's existence somehow rules out evil. And so Mackey and other defenders of the argument need to give us a reason to believe that God's existence is incompatible with evil. And 1 through 7 are exactly that reason. They flesh out in logical detail why it is that if God exists, then there is no evil. I think that the bottom is going to get cut off there. Sorry about that. But AE10 just says God does not exist, right? So 8, 9, and 10 if God exists, then there's no evil. There is evil, so God does not exist. And 10 follows from 8 and 9. Valid? Well, yes. We just walked through the steps. I told you where each of them came from. And then for every step that logically followed from some prior step, we saw intuitively what the logical connection was and what follows from what. So it's valid, and the only other question to be asked is it sound? Whereas before we wanted to know, if you're a theist, right, you're going to reject the conclusion. It's a valid argument, so you'd better reject one of the premises. But you can't reject 9 because it's intuitively obvious, and 8 follows logically and validly from prior steps. So that means that if you reject 8, you better reject something before 8. Well, what can you possibly reject? Doesn't seem like you can reject either 2 or 4 because those are just part of the definition of theism. Somebody in class suggested, well, maybe we could say God's not perfect. And the reply that the classical theist is going to have is, sure, you can say that, and that's a legit view, but that's not what I mean by theism. And that's just another way of concluding that the God of classical theism doesn't exist. Some other being kind of like it does, but that's a way of conceding the conclusion. So this is Mackey says something about solutions to the problem that jettison one or more of the core properties of God. And I think classical theist and atheist alike will agree that those solutions to the problem are really just ways of accepting the conclusion and saying, but I'm not pushed to say that there's nothing like God. There's something God-like, but maybe it's more flawed than we thought. So we'll put that aside. If we can't reject 2 or 5, that leaves only a few options. AE4 seems pretty plausible. An omnipotent being can eliminate every evil, because an omnipotent being can do anything. And then all of the other steps follow from previous steps. So that leaves only one step here remaining that the theist can push back against, and that's this first claim, that a perfectly good being eliminates every evil that it can. Indeed, as we'll see, this is precisely the place that the theist has an advantage over this first version of the argument. There's a case to be made that as a perfectly general claim about what a perfectly good being does, AE1 is well, maybe on the right track, is not strictly speaking true. There are counterexamples, actual and possible, I think, although you might say maybe there's no actually perfectly good being. So maybe all of the counterexamples are merely possible. But we can very concretely imagine examples of beings that are approaching perfection in their goodness, but that have good reason to not eliminate certain evils. And that's the structure of the perfectly good doctor counterexample.